Good morning, everyone. First of all, before I introduce our speaker, I want to say thank you to Nancy Spees. Is Nancy here on Zoom?
No.
Not here yet? I'm sure she's going to join us. She's been communicating with both of us about this.
She's here. She's on this participants list.
Good, good. I wanted to point out and thank Nancy for telling us about Gail Owen Crocker, because we would not have known about her, and this is going to be a very special lecture today. Thank you, Nancy. And if you received your recent needle arts, I just got mine yesterday. She's the featured designer in this issue. Very nice. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Gail Owen Crocker. She's Professor Emerita of the University of Manchester, UK, and was previously Professor of Anglo-Saxon Culture and Director of the Manchester Center for Anglo-Saxon Studies. A recognized authority on medieval dress and textiles, she has lectured in 12 countries. Her books include Dress in Anglo-Saxon England and Clothing the Past. She has published 27 articles on the Bayeux tapestry, 15 of which appear in the Bayeux Tapestry collected papers, and edited 4 essay collections about the tapestry. She's currently writing a monograph, The Design of the Bayeux Tapestry. She was editor-chief of the Encyclopedia of Medieval Dress and Textiles of the British Isles, circa 450 to 1450. With Robert Netherton, she co-founded the journal Medieval Clothing and Textiles. Something here would turn off the lights. This lecture, The Embroidery of the Bayeux Tapestry, will focus closely on the embroidery, considering materials, stitches, color choices, and working methods. It will consider individual images of people and creatures, showing how each one is unique, thanks to the versatile medium of embroidery. Thank you, Gail, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm very grateful to you for inviting me. It's lovely to meet you all. It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon here in Manchester, UK, an uncharacteristically sunny day. I'm sorry you have rain. I'm going to share my screen with you now, and we'll have a look at the Bayeux tapestry. Okay. I'm just trying to get rid of those thumbnails and not succeeding at the moment. I will in a moment, I'm sure. Can you still hear me?
Yes. Don't
Yes.
you have to play the PowerPoint?
Yeah, I'm afraid my icons have just gone up to the top and got in the way. That's it, slideshow from current slide. That's it. Right. Well, here is an image from the front and the back of it. And you can see that it's heavily patched, especially at the beginning and the end. The Bayeux tapestry is a World Heritage treasure. It's the largest surviving piece of medieval cloth that we have. In fact, it's the largest surviving medieval artifact, apart from architectural remains. It's a narrative frieze, 224 feet, 4 inches long, and the end is missing, so it was longer. And it's just 20 inches wide. This slide shows it as it's currently displayed in the Bayeux Tapestry Museum in Normandy, northern France. So you can see that what we've got is a main register where the narrative is taking place, framed by borders, top and bottom, which are mostly occupied by pairs of birds and beasts alternating. Sometimes, as there on the right, the ship's sails have taken over the top border. Sometimes other things happen in the bottom border, like we have a set of Aesop's fables. And you can see a number there written in ink. These numbers are written on the back cloth, which isn't original, but it is medieval, it's later medieval. But the numbers were written for an exhibition in the 19th century, and they don't have any original authority, but they are extremely useful in describing scenes. So we're at scene 37 here. And the tapestry at the moment is in this case, but it's really more like a tank, because it's enclosed front and back. It's controlled for temperature, humidity, insects, everything. It's completely sealed in there. And if you visit it in the Bayeux Museum at the moment, you walk straight along it until you get to this hairpin bend, and then you walk to the end on the other side. And that means you can't ever see the whole thing at once, which to me is a negative point about this display. It's extremely dramatic. You wait in the entrance with your headphones on to get the commentary. And I remember waiting on the brink the first time I visited it, and I could see the thickness of the embroidered wool. And that's a dimension that is completely lost in any photographs, however good they are. You can't appreciate from the photographs how very alive it is, how much that embroidery stands out, thick wool against fine linen. This display isn't there for much longer. It's going to be taken down in 2025, and the tapestry is going to be rehung in a new purpose-built museum. They have just published what they're going to do with it. They're going to hang it in a single length, which means a very long room indeed, which will have the advantage that you can see it all at the same time if there aren't too many people in the way. But they are going to tilt it slightly, because the conservationists feel that hanging it upright puts too much strain on the fabric. And I would agree, really, because the embroidery is obviously very heavy. The wool is heavy. And although it was meant to be seen upright like this, probably not to be hung all day, every year. So they're going to do some conservation on it, some study of it, and then completely rehang it in a new display. This is the opening scene. It's one that has to make impact, because the whole narrative is about the struggle for the throne of England. And what we see in the opening scene is King Edward the Confessor, enthroned rather grandly. He's the grandest seated figure. Now, I know you've had a lecture on the Bayeux Tapestry before, so you do know something about it if you attended that lecture, but I'm just going to run through the story very briefly so that when I pause on an image, you'll understand the relevance of it. So here, King Edward is saying goodbye to his brother-in-law and most powerful subject, Harold. We don't know where Harold is going, but we see him setting off on horseback. He calls in at his own estate on the south coast at Bosom, and then he takes ship across the channel. We don't know where he intended to go, but where he ends up is in Ponthieu, which is in France. And immediately on his landing, he's arrested by the count of that region, Guy of Ponthieu, spelled Guido in Latin. The captions are in Latin. A messenger gets to Duke William of Normandy and tells him about Harold's captivity. William dispatches his own envoys to go and bully, cajole, bribe Guy into parting with his prisoner, and eventually Harold is handed over to William. Now, William is a cousin of King Edward on the mother's side, not on the father's royal line of England side. Both these men eventually, if not at this time, have designs on the English throne. Probably Edward had hinted to William that he would inherit it long before. But by 1064 or so, Edward was more interested in hunting than in ruling, and Harold was effectively ruling the country. So we can't be surprised if Harold wanted it for himself. Harold's sister Edith is married to King Edward, but they have not had any children. Harold evidently pleases William and they go on campaign together. Harold performs well and is rewarded by William, which is a bit of a two-pronged thing because it means Harold is now obliged to William. William allows him to go home, but before he leaves, he extracts an oath from him. We don't know what the oath says because the captions don't tell us, but Harold looks very uncomfortable swearing it. And he leaves as soon as he can, gets back to England, where he finds the king very much aged. And the next thing we see is the king on his deathbed and being buried in Westminster Abbey. The nobles of England offer Harold the crown, and we see him being crowned in Westminster Abbey almost immediately. But just after that, Halley's Comet appears, and it's seen as a bad omen. Messengers get to William in Normandy and tell him that Harold has taken the crown. He orders a fleet to be built and he invades. And the story ends with the Battle of Hastings and the death of Harold. And that's where it breaks off as English troops are fleeing after the death of their king. We don't know how it ended, but there's probably not a lot missing. This is the infamous scene where Harold is killed, as the caption says. It's generally assumed that the man with the arrow to his face is Harold, but actually that arrow is a 19th century reconstruction. There was a row of stitch holes, but we don't know that it was an arrow. It was first sketched in by Charles Stoddard, who was painting the tapestry. And since then, it's been added in needlework. We do know that Harold was cut down by swords. The fact that he died from an arrow to the eye isn't mentioned until 12th century sources considerably later. But the guy bottom right who's being cut down by a sword actually has stitch holes to the eye. So maybe there was an arrow in his face and maybe it's the same man. And what we're seeing here is continuous action, first struck by the arrow to the face and then cut down. It's because the tapestry shows the Battle of Hastings in detail that we know it must be at least 1066 that it was made, probably in the next 20 years. So we're looking at the 1070s or the 1080s for this. It was probably designed in Canterbury. I've put an arrow on Canterbury, bottom right there. Canterbury is in Kent, southeast of England. The main reason we think it was made in Canterbury is that it models many of its images on illustrations in manuscripts which still survive today that are known to have been in Canterbury in the 11th century. Edward and Harold is probably modelled on Abraham being congratulated by a king. You can see they've got the same crown, they've got the same broad shape of architecture, it's the same kind of mise en scène. And also, the Bayeux tapestry uses the same graphic style as the Canterbury manuscripts. It draws or fills in with colour parts of its illustration, but hands and faces are left bare. On the left, it's bare parchment. On the right, it's bare linen. But it's a very similar effect. Here's another one. This is from the Old English hexateuch, and it's Lot warning his prospective sons-in-law, who are men of Sodom, that the city is going to be destroyed. And I think it's rather a cheeky borrowing by the Bayeux designer to have William and his brother, Bishop Odo, cast as the Sodomites. That's perhaps a little in joke for the monks of St. Augustine's monastery who knew this manuscript, but the Norman conquerors wouldn't have known it because it's written in English and they wouldn't have read English. Anyway, you can see that the linen is left bare behind the figures and that features are sketched in, but otherwise hands and faces are bare. So it's a fairly economical kind of embroidering. Right. So blocks of colour fill in animals' bodies, clothing, and that sort of thing. It was probably embroidered in England because English embroidery was famous, although it's goldwork embroidery that's mostly mentioned. But if it was designed in Canterbury, as it surely was, it was probably embroidered in England. And I put this map up because you can see how directly Bayeux and Caen, which was William's seat, relate to Bosom, which is where Harold sailed from. But Harold actually ended up here in France, probably blown by the wind. Now, the tapestry's probably been in Bayeux, in what was part of the Duchy of Normandy here, since soon after it was made. The connection with Bayeux being that Odo, Bishop of Bayeux, was the half-brother of the Duke of Normandy, who became King of England. The brothers were very close. At the Norman conquest, Odo was made Earl of Kent, and he sometimes acted as regent for his brother. He was the most important commoner, and he had enormous wealth and lands in England. It is possible that the Bayeux tapestry was actually made for Bishop Odo. He is depicted in it several times and named. But whether it was made for him or not, it probably travelled to Bayeux with him, either on a visit to his bishopric or when he was disgraced and exiled from England in 1082. It was rediscovered in Bayeux Cathedral in the 18th century. And just to finish this contextualization, it's called the Bayeux tapestry from the French word tapisserie, which means a carpet or a hanging, and it is indeed a wall hanging. But it isn't technically a tapestry where the pattern is inserted while the textile is on the loom. It is, the reason I'm here, an embroidery. It's worked with needles in 2-ply wool on fairly fine linen. The thread count of the linen averages 22 by 18 threads per centimetre. And there are 9 pieces of linen joined together with seams that are almost invisible on the front. I've arrowed at the top there the first seam, but you have to be looking for it to see it. Indeed, they're so hard to see that the final seam was only discovered in the 1980s when they took it down and removed the lining to examine the back of the tapestry. And then they discovered it was 9 pieces, not 8, as previously thought. So clearly, since the seams are so nearly invisible, the whole thing was meant to be a continuum, which makes it a bit of a puzzle. It must have been intended for a very big space, but narrow top to bottom, but where it wouldn't be interrupted by openings, such as doors, windows, and stairs. We can talk about that at the end if you want. The first 2 pieces of linen are very long indeed, and it seems that they were embroidered in separate workshops with people working simultaneously to save time. And then they were brought together to be joined. And there must have been consternation when this happened, because as you can see, the top 2 borders don't match. The first workshop, first Altis, has left a gap at the end, and perhaps amusingly has put 2 birds asleep at the top because there's nothing much happening. And then the artist of the second piece has started with 2 birds. Well, you never get that. You never get 2 pairs of birds together. You get bird, beast, with fantasy creatures with wings alternating for either bird or beast. The bottom border must have been left to be filled in. You can see there are 2 matching creatures there on either side of the seam, but there's an extra goat and a tree being added where I put the arrow at the bottom, just to fill in fairly unobtrusively that some adjustment is being made for the join. So the bottom border is better handled than the top. After this hitch, the workshops get more sophisticated about using fillers in the borders and embroidering over part of the seams, which adds to the invisibility. This is the second seam, and it's at a double seam depicting the death of Edward the Confessor, and down below the shrouding of his corpse. And I've marked where the scene is at the top and at the left side, and it actually runs through the figure of the man who's assisting with the shrouding, or rather, he is embroidered over the top of it. But as you can see, it isn't perfect. That man's right leg never got filled in. Now, scholars critiquing the tapestry always blame the embroiderers. I resent this. I embroider. I think it's more likely that the draft person who put the cartoon on the linen was at fault here, because the seam is right in that spot. Putting the cartoon on the linen is a necessary stage in production that scholars who don't embroider rarely take into account. This scene has been, to some extent, planned as far as the border's concerned. We've got a central plant, and we've got a pair of birds, and then some other plants. But these plants are not like the plants in the top and border here in general. I think they've been added later, or perhaps put in first, if this scene was sort of pre-laid out before the rest of it was. The embroidery is in 2-ply wool. The dyes are all vegetable dyes, combinations of woad and madder. The people who examined it in the 1980s identified that there are 10 colours of wool, and they described them as 2 shades of red, a yellow, a beige, 3 shades of blue, one of them blue-black, and 3 shades of green. We're fortunate to have some pictures of the back. These are not available to the general public, but I have been able to access some of them for you. And we can see from the back that the blue colours have suffered particularly from the light. You can see from King Edward's crown that what's now a dull green was originally pale blue. And from this one, this is Bishop Odo riding into battle to rally the troops. And you can see from the back that his dark blue horse was originally bright blue, and so was his helmet and his hand. I've said that this work is economical. There's considerable use of the plain linen for colour contrast. In this case, the shields that are hung along the side of Harold's ship are regularly left plain, alternating with those embroidered in brown or green. The examination of the tapestry in the 1980s found some use of plain white wool, but they don't illustrate it or say where it occurs in their very brief publication on the subject. And when I was drafting this lecture, I wrote in, and I have not found it. At least I thought I hadn't found it until I was preparing your slides, and I think I have. I was going to say, even when depicting ecclesiastical vestments, the Archbishop alb, which should be white, it's coloured. There is no white embroidery. And then I realised that the details on the Archbishop's pallium are actually highlighted in white. So I'm not swearing it, but I may have found the white wool there just by chance, thanks to you. Experts are now able to do tests with ultraviolet light, which can show up different dye lots. I have seen ultraviolet photographs of this, but it isn't published yet, and we have to look forward to the results of that research being published. I don't know whether different workshops might have got different dye lots. We need to see. Today, it's sometimes difficult to determine from the front what is original and what is repair. In fact, some 19th century chemical dyes have lost their colour and they're now almost completely transparent. Another colour that stands out as being unauthentic is a garish red. You can see it here on these mail coats, and it's used a lot towards the end of the tapestry. You've got red hands and red mail coats. The end of the tapestry is very damaged from handling, as the beginning is. For a long time, the tapestry was mounted on a roller, and to view it, you turned a handle like getting a bucket up from a well, and the end and the beginning have particularly been damaged by that. This group of figures galloping away at the end are almost entirely reconstruction, and the bottom border, those naked figures are much more curvy than your usual Bayeux tapestry graphics are. So the stitches, well, the colouring in is laid and couched. I've taken these images from the Elara website. I didn't see how to acknowledge that at all, so I'm saying this, and if anybody knows that, please convey to Elara my gratitude. It's the best illustration of laid and couched work that I've seen. The long stitches are laid down almost entirely on the front, so the embroiderers aren't wasting any wool on the back that won't be seen. And then those long stitches are couched down with shorter stitches at right angles to them, and those couching stitches are themselves couched down with tiny little stitches. The characteristic ribbed appearance of the Bayeux tapestry images is caused by the couching stitches. This is most apparent when the couching thread has faded differently, or a slightly different shade was used. And you can see that William and the horse on the right of the main picture have this ribbed appearance, but actually the couching stitches go the other way. This is the laid stitches go the other way. This is the couching stitches that are giving that appearance. The garment of William and the horse look dark green to us, but actually pictures of the back show that they were originally blue. Look at the close-up of William seated and see how the stitching changes direction to reflect anatomy, arms, waist area, hips. Now, this kind of double couching in wool is unparalleled as far as I know. Laid work, couched is common enough, but then couching the couching is not. Earlier English embroiderers were doing couching of gold threads with silk. On the left, we've got an animal detail from the Marseille embroideries, which are not very well known. And on the right, we've got a little bit from the Durham vestments. We have an embroidered stole and maniple, richly decorated with gold. It's got tablet woven borders, also decorated with gold. And then the background, the contours of the clothing and the saint's halo are all done in gold work, couched in silk, but it's just couched the once. The closest parallel to our Bayeux couching appears to be this very little known embroidered fragment from the tomb of William of St. Calais. He was the first Norman bishop of Durham, and he died in 1096. And this and another fragment are presumably from the vestments that he was buried in. So they might have been made 20 years before, and are probably roughly contemporary with the Bayeux tapestry. I'm grateful to Alexandra Lester-Makin for use of her microscopic photograph, which shows that the silk, undyed silk threads, unspun silk threads, have been couched and then recouched. And that bit is where two edges of the leaf pattern come together. And it's just here. So we have a roughly contemporary parallel of the technique, but it's in different materials. It's in silk. We haven't got in anything like the Bayeux tapestry in wool. So that's the couching. The Bayeux outlines and the contours of the dress and of the bodies of animals are done in stem stitch, which is ideal for curves, of course. Now, it would seem likely that the contours and outlines were put in first and acted as a guide for the embroiderers doing the filling in. But the pictures of the back actually don't make this clear. When you know you're going to see pictures of the back, you think, oh, this is it. I'm going to understand everything. But actually, they are only photographs. It's not like having face-to-face touch to the back. there are an awful lot of loose threads. They start with a knot, but they don't fasten off their ends. So you can have a piece of thread going across that doesn't actually mean anything. It isn't joining anything. It's just a bit of loose thread. So in fact, it's very difficult to tell if a stem stitch line comes first or the couching, the laden couched work comes first. You can only be sure if one overlays the other or catches the other. So I have to say, I don't know. I would guess the outlines and the contours come first, but I can't swear to it. These pictures were taken in the 1982 to 1983 survey, and they're not the best quality, and they're not, as I said, readily available, but it is interesting to see them. So I'm talking about stem stitch, and it's generally agreed that stem stitch is used for outlines and contours. But I think an important point is that there's much more use of stem stitch than the scholars have acknowledged. Stem stitch lines in parallel are quite often used for filling. Now, here the dark parts of William's garters are stem stitched. It isn't that areas are too small for couching. Quite small areas might be couched. Here, the horseshoes on the horse's rear legs are couched. But the red horseshoe on a foreleg is stem stitch. So are the rider's shoe, his garters, and stirrup leather. I'm guessing that this was an individual embroiderer's choice. So at last we're actually getting to know an embroiderer, somebody who's choosing what stitch to use. There's more stem stitch filling than usual in this scene. Harold has just landed in Ponthieu, contrary to plans, and on coming ashore, he's immediately arrested by Guy, called Guido in the caption, who's the man on horseback. Harold and his men, identified by tunics, the French are wearing culottes, and by his pudding bowl sort of hairstyle and his moustache, is also distinguished by a striped skirt. Now, I'm not suggesting that the stripes are realistic, that they have patterned striped skirts, or even that they depict pleats. I think it's to identify Harold for the viewer. But those stripes are all depicted in rows of stem stitch. I think we have an embroiderer on this scene who likes working stem stitch. I can show you details. The men's belts are stem stitch, and so is the right-hand man's neckband. And actually, the use of stem stitch started with the previous figure, top left here, who's pulling the ship's small boat into the shore. The rope he's pulling, his belt, and his neckband are all stem stitch. I think the man behind Harold in the group is meant to be a continuation of that man. The fact that he's wearing different colours is not something that bothers the Bayeux tapestry embroiders. You don't get continuity in the movie sense of the word in the Bayeux tapestry. But the man too has a rope behind his back, and it's still stem stitch, although there's an anomaly here because the rope doesn't continue. And on the right of this slide, the mane and the tack of Guy's horse are also done in stem stitch. Although it's only recently been recognised, the embroiderers evidently diverted from the general house rules of using laden couch work plus stem stitch in order to depict details as authentically as possible. Alexandra Lester-Makin has taken microphotographs of this image, which are not yet published, so I can't show them to you. I know about it because I'm the editor of the book in which her chapter appears. And she shows that the head of the figure in the right-hand window has straight stitches which have been couched down. So again, we're finding a creative embroiderer just doing something ad hoc because that seems the best way to depict features. It was once thought that any chain stitch in the Bayeux tapestry was the work of 19th century repairers. But the examination of the tapestry in the 1980s established that there is some original chain stitch in the inscription. It isn't used very often, and arguably it was used in this scene because the scene is very important. It shows the English councillors offering the crown to Harold. Here they gave to Harold the king's crown, is what the Latin says. Harold, the king's brother-in-law, not in the royal line, but the effective governor of a kingdom that's threatened by Viking attacks as well as the Normans. And this scene establishes that in this version of the story, Harold did not seize a crown that rightfully belonged to William of Normandy, as Norman propagandists would argue. It is given to him by the nobles of the kingdom. So you can see that the letters of that inscription are particularly thick. There are some lines of double stem stitch, parallel stem stitch, and there's this use of chain. Are there occasional chain stitches like these? And I've got you the detail, are 19th century repairs. It was a good idea to depict rope with chain stitch because a good idea of the texture, but it isn't original. Incidentally, it's only when I was looking at this and checking the back of the image to make sure it was reconstruction that I realized that the yard, that is the spar from which the sail is hanging, is in fact all stem stitched. It's only the back being all filled in that told me it was stem stitch. So there is a lot more stem stitch than is credited. I want to talk a bit more about the use of colour. Oh, there's your yard and the back of it. You can see that laid and couched work leaves a lot of gaps. It's just the couching stitches that show. The laid work is hardly visible at all on the back, whereas stem stitch is more wasteful. You're putting wool onto the back. So I want to talk a bit more about the use of colour. With a limited palette, colour can't be naturalistic. When the tapestry came to prominence in the 19th century, journalists thought it was really funny. Naive people thinking that horses were green and human hair was green. Well, medieval people didn't read colour in the same way we do. They saw light or dark animals. They saw blonde or brunette hair. They didn't see green hair or blue hair. I'm quite convinced. But changes of colour are used in quite a subtle way to mark different parts of man-made structures. So stripes of different colours indicate the planks that ships are constructed of and the loom widths of fabric from which the sails are made. Now, obviously, there's some shorthand in this. There would have been more planks. These are genuine Viking Age ships, which survive because they were used for funerals, and they are archaeological finds, miraculously preserved. They have about twice as many planks. But the Bayeux tapestry gives a good idea of it. If you compare, say, a child's drawing of a rowing boat, it would probably just give you the outline. It wouldn't give you any sense of the construction. This is much more sensitive than that. Colour change also marks the anatomical divisions of body parts of animals. Notice how the horse's inside legs are very often depicted in a different colour. So are those of the lions and the wolves in the border. The wing feathers of birds are cleverly suggested with colour contrast, although again, they're simplified. There are many, many more quill feathers in the wing of a bird than that, but you get the sense of individual feathers, don't you? Now, I've said that colour is not naturalistic, but I strongly suggest that embroiderers often used yellow to indicate metallic gold and light blue for silver. Unfortunately, it's this light blue that's turned to dull green. But if we return to this opening image of King Edward, he's enthroned in splendour, and we can appreciate that his crown and his sceptre are gold and silver, and that he's probably got a gold torque round his neck, and that he's got gold embroidery on his robe, all done in yellow wool, but we learn to use our imaginations. We learn to read yellow as gold in certain circumstances, and we learn to read pale blue as silver. I think this is important when we look at armour. The standard war gear for both armies is chainmail. And I think the embroiderers struggle a bit to depict chainmail. They evidently experimented, or the draftspersons putting the cartoon on experimented, but I think it's the embroiderers, and I'll show you why in a minute. They experimented with how to stitch it to indicate the linked rings which were characteristic of mail coats in the period. In the Brittany campaign, early on in the tapestry, they used tight circles, which are perhaps true to the appearance of mail coats, but very time-consuming to execute. And if you look at the picture on the left, the person working from the bottom up to the middle has used tighter circles than the person who's embroidering from the top to the middle. And time is short. They don't bother to unpick errors like that. We still have their mistakes. So I think the person working from the top has already thought the tight circles are just too fiddly by far. And so we get them meeting in the middle. Yeah. By the time we get to the scene showing armour and supplies being loaded into the Norman ships for the invasion, the wider squares or diamonds and circles, sometimes circles in the breastplate bit, are being used. Now, this isn't realistic. If they were really that far apart, they'd easily be pierced by a spear or an arrow. But it's suggestive. But in all cases, they're this lightish green that was originally pale blue, which I think indicates silver. We find diamonds and tight circles as the Normans ride into the English countryside and pillage it for their own food. We have a couple of attempts to depict William in rather elaborate armour, This first one, he's got some yellow to it, which is perhaps suggesting he had gilding as the leader, as a duke. And inexplicably, he's got some red diamonds between his pale blue circles in the second one. But by the time we get to the preliminaries to the Battle of Hastings and the battle itself, the embroiderers have settled for an economical version, large circles or squares or diamonds. The colouring must have been thought out in advance. I mean, in advance of embroidering a whole scene. You don't get two shields in the sequence of the same colour. And similarly, you don't get two horses. We've got another mistake here. The person starting from the bottom and the front of this horse started to do it in brown, perhaps not realizing there was another brown horse coming up on the flank. Somebody corrected this embroidery and the horse became dark reddish brown. But again, they didn't unpick the mistake. And so we can see somebody's working from the top, somebody's working from the bottom. In a sequence like this, no two horses are exactly alike. There's a colour difference both in the bodies of the horses and in the details. You might get two horses in the same shade of brown, but their tack won't be exactly the same colour. The first light brown horse has dark blue tack and a dark brown bridle. The second one has a brown bridle and a white chest band. Where am I? Oh no, he's dark, isn't he? The next one has a brown bridle and a white chest band, and the next light brown horse has all white tack. So it is carefully worked out, and they very often have different coloured hooves and then different coloured horseshoes on those hooves. And you can see here that there's a difference in the armour. The men look practically identical at first sight, but somebody's taken the trouble to put the first man in circles, the second man in diamonds, then we have circles, then we have sort of scallops. And so figures are given some individuality. I find that fascinating. Now, the horse images and everything else in the tapestry were almost certainly made with templates. For the horses, you get the same body part images used over and over again. Yet they're put at different angles, they're given different colours, and so no two horses in the tapestry are exactly identical. And this difference in individual images is a characteristic aspect of the Bayeux tapestry. It's part of the vitality for me. And it extends to the border creatures too. The fact that the pairs of border creatures don't exactly match is interesting. It's as if they've deliberately been given individuality, which, as I say, accounts for some of the vitality of it. It isn't just about colour, it's also about position. Whereas with a woven textile, you get the same image repeated, albeit reversed and sometimes upside down. Because it's preset, you're getting the same image over and over again. With an embroidery, you have more freedom. The cartoons may be differently placed. They may have different detail. One lion may have its tail up, another lion may have its tail twisted around its body. And the embroiderers can vary their colours, and their techniques. If we look at this final detail of two borders, the creatures at the top are slightly different in position. The bird top left has obviously been fitted into a space too small for it. I find it amazing that they didn't measure these spaces. They were perfectly capable of measuring. They had dividers, which are used for measuring, but they didn't, and they don't get their diagonal lines parallel either, so I don't know why. But this unfortunate bird is in a space too small for it, so it's been angled, which immediately makes it different from its partner. It's a bit smaller, so it's not done with exactly the same templates, and the embroiderers have chosen to do it in different colours. The one on the left is probably not finished. And bottom border birds here have been done in completely different colours. The wing on the right is wider than the wing on the left. The beak on the right-hand bird has a little down curve on the bottom of the bill, which the other one doesn't have. And the stitching is different. The bird at the top left has a tail entirely in stem stitch. And the one on the right, I'm talking about the sideways bird and the other one top left now. So the one on the left has tail entirely in stem stitch. The one on the right has a bar across its tail, which is in stem stitch, but its tail feathers are inlaid and couched work. Its leg is in stem stitch, but the other bird's leg is couched. And at the bottom, we have a different beak, different wing, and a different tail. The one with the curly beak has a curly tail as well. The weaver creates images mechanically, impersonally. The embroiderer creates them individually. And the animation which that imparts to human and animal figures alike is a big contributor to the fascination of the Bayeux tapestry. I don't know whether the master designer intended such variety in his border creatures. We could attribute it to carelessness in putting the templates on, and to a freedom in the embroiderers who didn't expect to be constrained. And that's just one of the little fascinations of the Bayeux tapestry. I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you. Pretty much. Oh, goodness. Gail, that was fantastic. There was one comment in chat about when you had showed all the variety and the horses lined up that pointed out like the manes were also all different from one from the other.
Yes. And they can be done in different stitches as well. Different ways of doing manes. Yeah.
And Mary Todd had one question in chat. I'll let her ask it.
So you mentioned a couple of times about economy,
Yes.
in their techniques. And I was just curious, do you think it was economy of materials or economy of time, or maybe both?
Both. I think it was done fast. It must have taken a very long time to design it and, well, to order all the materials. When you think that everything had to be hand spun, they had to order it, then they had to have the linen woven, and it's fairly consistently woven, so they had to order the lengths of linen. And then the drafting, I think, would have taken a long time. But the embroidery could have taken years. And I think it was done for speed, yes. But yes, it saves materials, certainly, yes. Economy of effort. But they don't mind you filling in, say that's that wooden yard with stem stitch if they think that's the right thing. They're not running short, but for the big stuff, laden can.
Thank you.
Candy has a question. Her hand is raised.
Thank you very much for this lecture. I have two thoughts. I want to say first that economy of wool would have made the piece lighter. If it had needed to be transported, it would have made a huge difference in the weight of the piece.
That is so true.
The second thought is when I was doing an art history degree, and that was 20 years ago, so I'm sure the research has changed a bit. But one of the thoughts was that because at the time the population was illiterate and needed to learn through visual imagery, that this was actually something that was carried around to churches to support William's taking over of the throne. It was a visual for the common person to accept William as a ruler at that time, that it was done after he ascended to the throne, and it was done to support his monarchy. And it was carried around. It was a like a newspaper. People couldn't read then, but they could see visual imagery, and that it was carried around, and its length was used in cathedrals and things like that, so that the common person could understand their current event history recent to their past.
Well, certainly textiles were carried around. Excuse me, I'm getting hoarse. That's a big advantage of wall hangings over wall paintings, because rulers were peripatetic and they packed up their favorite furnishings and moved on to the next castle to eat all the peasants out of house and home before they moved on to the next one. So yes, I'm sure it was meant to be moved. The inscription is in Latin, which is elite language. So there is an inscription. It's really interesting if you go to Bayeux and listen to what people are saying, which I love to do. And the people who don't know any Latin don't even see that inscription. You hear them speculating to each other. I wonder if that's showing this. And I want to say, yes, it is. It says so at the top, but they don't even see it. It's like there's an ivory whalebone casket that has a runic inscription. And I don't read runes unless I'm given a printout of it. And I just don't see it, you know. It's like a pretty frame to me. The letters don't mean anything. So the inscription is for an elite who can read it. The pictures are for anybody who can see it. One suggestion is that it was commentated, that you would have a guide to it who would take you around and explain it to you, which is possible. We don't know whether it was made for a secular place or for a cathedral. A reproduction looks very silly hanging around the pillars of Bayeux Cathedral today, I must say. I think myself it was made for a secular space, and it probably went on the wall above the benches.
Mm-hmm.
And it was probably a square Norman keep, which had a spiral staircase in the corner. And that's where it started. That's why the first length of linen starts partway along the wall, and the second length of linen is longer. I think it was more or less a square, but with the corner missing. But that didn't mean it could be hung anywhere. We do have a cedarwood box that it was carried in. It's still in Bayeux Cathedral in the treasury, and without the backing, it could be folded up, concertinaed. You can't do that with it now, of course. It's too fragile when they move it. So I don't personally think it was designed solely for that purpose. I think it was designed for an elite patron, probably either William or Odo. there is an argument that it was designed to hang in St. Augustine's Abbey choir. They did it for themselves. But it certainly could be used as a teaching tool. And it probably was in the late medieval period when it was hung up in Bayeux Cathedral for 8 days every year for the Feast of Relics, because it shows Harold swearing on the relics of Bayeux. So it's really appropriate to hang it up for the Feast of Relics. So probably people walked around it then and may have done before that. But I think it started off as an elite furnishing, but it could have been shown anywhere. Yeah. Thank you.
We do have a few more comments and I'm sorry. We do have a few more comments in chat. I can open now. Yes. Well, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation, wonderful comments. It's a huge privilege to see such intimate views of the work. Is the cartoon paint similar in makeup to the wool dyes?
Oh, that's what we all want to know. We can't see any trace of the cartoon. It's never been found. Now, Simone Bertrand, who was once the curator of the tapestry, wrote quite a lot about it, and she considered it had been washed, which might have washed out any cartoon. We can't see it. I would love to know what it was. I can suggest it might have been ink. You can draw directly on linen. It might have been lead point. They did have lead point tools that are the forerunner of modern pencils. It might have been charcoal. Now, in a paper I published a couple of years ago with Maggie Neen on the templates, I suggested, because it had been suggested to me by a paleographer, that they could even have used silver point. But I now find out that you can't use silver point on textile because you have to treat it with egg to make the silver go black. And you can't do that on the textile. It would be too messy and it would fill the holes and things. So I'm down to 3 things: ink, lead point, or charcoal. Conceivably, if they'd used ink, they could have used different coloured inks and so indicated to the embroiderers what colours to use. But the problem with doing that is you have to keep changing ink pots and you have to let it dry before you do an adjoining image. So that's rather time consuming if you do that. I don't think they would have done prick and pounce method, which is where you will know better than I probably, where you force probably charcoal through tiny pricked holes on a leather or parchment pattern. And the reason I think not is that leather and parchment need dead animals. And for something this big, you would have needed a tremendous number of animal carcasses because you can't use the pattern again, not unless you're repeating that image. And as we've seen, the Bayeux tapestry does things differently. It does have sort of the same horse's leg over and over again, the same bird's wing, and it will use the same shape of a bird's wing for a shield as well. It's quite free in the way it uses the images, but uses the shapes. But I really don't think prick and pounce is practical when you can draw direct on linen. So in answer to your questioner, I'd love to know. I talked to the chief scientist at the British Museum, who is on the scientific committee for the research into the Bayeux tapestry. They've got in France, they've got an enormous grant to do research as well as conservation on it. And I suggested to her that they might be able to test for metal. And she said it was possible. Now, I'm not sure if
Hold
it's,
it this corner, bring over to this corner.
sorry? I'm not sure if they can test for metal without having a detached piece, but they do have one detached piece that they could use. But I would love to know, and there is just no trace of it. Either it's faded, or it's been washed out, or it's completely covered.
Yeah, there are a couple of other questions in chat.
Yes.
There are photographs of the box available.
Yes. Elizabeth Carson Paston has got a picture of the box in her book and in an article she's publishing shortly, I think. The book is by Elizabeth Carson Paston and Stephen White. And if you'll excuse me a minute, I'll give you the title of it. Gosh, got too much on that shelf. The Bayeux tapestry and its contexts. This is the one that suggests that it was made for St. Augustine's. I'll see if I can find you the box. Again, if you give me a minute.
I'll read a couple of the comments that came in while you're looking.
Yeah, yeah.
I was amazed at the diversity with similar images with the stitching by the embroiderer.
Yeah.
I gather that Latin was used on the tapestry as it was known by scholars in different countries where the item may have traveled.
Huh?
And another comment from your narrative, I feel able to picture the audience and the makers more as live people than abstractions.
Say that one again.
From your narrative, I feel able
Oh,
to
yes.
picture the audience
Yes.
and make more as live people.
Yes. Sorry, I haven't found the box. Oh, just a minute. Drawing. I thought it was in this book. I've got the cupboard, the cupboard that held relics, but I haven't got the box. I may have on my phone my own picture of the box buried deep in my gallery. If I have, I'll send the picture to Alice and you can circulate it. It's a surprisingly small box. I want to come back to the Latin because the inscription is really a study in itself. It's one of the earliest examples of medieval multilingualism. Later on in the medieval period, merchants and people writing accounts of textiles or anything else would flit between English, French, and Latin in the sentence. They really were multilingual. And the Latin of the Bayeux tapestry is like Latin spoken with a Norman accent. And it uses some words that were not in classical Latin. They're kind of more vulgar Latin, sort of more like the language of Norman French. But there are a few Englishisms in it as well, including two letters that were in the Old English alphabet, Ash and F, which were not, and they're used for names. For a woman, Alfgiver, she's spelt with an ash, and Harold's brother, when he's killed, Girth, the th on the end, they use the letter F. So whoever wrote it down was used to writing English, even though he was writing Latin. So my take on that is that the agent of a Norman patron dictated it in Latin, what they wanted, the bare bones of what they wanted. And it says, here, this image, here, this, and where, that. Nearly every scene starts hic, here, or ubi, where. So I think somebody dictated this to a Latin-speaking English scribe who wrote down the names using the Old English letters. So that in itself is interesting. English had quite a high profile in England. From King Alfred's day, written English was quite common. Alfred had a very liberal attitude towards education. He wanted all freeborn males to be able to read. And he had his own daughters educated as well. So there were, and he arranged to have key texts translated from Latin into English, so people who didn't have Latin could read them. Latin was for the high flyers who were going on in church education. So there was quite a wide band of literacy at the upper end of England. Not necessarily so in Normandy. It was very much an English thing. But Latin was common to the church and probably to the elite. William and Harold would probably have understood some Latin. I'm fascinated with what they might have spoken when they were talking to each other. There is a scene where they're vigorously disputing. Harold's holding forth and William's listening to him. And I've recently written an article kind of saying, what language are they using? Was there a cleric on hand to translate it into Latin and then translate it back? If so, he doesn't appear in the scene. And I decided that Harold would almost certainly be able to speak Norman French. But anyway, that's another question. But the inscription can take you far. There's a lot to say about it. Yes, I could go on, but I won't.
Gail, there was one other question. Will you publish this research? And I had already mentioned you are about to publish a monograph, the design of the Bayeux tapestry. But I think Jeannie is asking about the embroidery research you've done. Do you have any plan to publish?
I've got a chapter in the new book called The Workshops, and I'm looking at the cartoon and how the cartoon might have been laid out. I mentioned all the possibilities and the fact that although it looks artless, it looks almost natural. It's not at all. It's all done with shapes, and sometimes the scenes appear within a square, and sometimes a rectangle, which is geometrically calculated, mathematically calculated. So there's nothing really spontaneous about it. That's why it's so clever. It passed as naive and artless for hundreds of years, and my book is trying to show that actually it's really scholarly because it borrows from lots and lots of manuscripts that the designer knew, and it's mathematically composed and that sort of thing. And but yes, I do talk about the embroiderers, and I do have a section on how much creativity they were allowed. I think that in the choice of colours and in whether they were using stem stitch or couching for a bird's tail, we must have individual people's choice. I like to think so. Agency.
Gail, Edie here has a question.
Hi, Gail. Thank you for this lecture. My question is twofold. One, how long do you think it took from, oh, we need to do this tapestry, to it being commissioned, to having sort of the timeline of how long it took from idea to actual completed tapestry? and about how much it would have cost in today's terms to do such a monumental undertaking?
I don't think they'd have paid in money. I think they'd have paid in kind. You know, you gave a gift, you gave a chalice, which could be converted into cash if you needed it. You perhaps gave a piece of land, and then the monastery would draw the rents from that land for evermore, kind of thing. So I can't put a monetary value on it. If it was commercial workshops doing it rather than convents, they must have had some accounting, but we don't have any records. We don't have any records of any workshops doing this kind of work. How long? Well, I think they put out the different pieces. I think pieces 1 and 2, the big ones, were worked separately. There are points in common between 4 and 5 and 5 and 6. But it's possible that the people working one piece had never seen another piece. So one person would decide to do the inscription in green and yellow, whereas it starts off in blue-black. It changes to black and red at a key scene, the banquet, the Norman banquet, which is one of these set pieces that must have been planned in advance. It's got the animals all lined up, that sort of thing. How long? If they're working full time, but we're probably talking about daylight hours, and they didn't have big windows. So how did they see to do it? Are they working by candlelight? They didn't have open cloisters in those days. It must surely have been framed up. All that takes time. Somebody would have had to make the frames, unless there's such productive commercial workshops that have got the frames already, unless they're making these for domestic consumption. Everybody has a woolen hanging on the wall. I think that's quite likely. We have hangings mentioned a lot in wills and donations, but not this big. This is enormous. A few years, start to finish. Just thinking it out. And it's got, and this is in the book as well, it's got a lot of anticipation and echo in it. It's got 2 feasts. If you lay it out as a square, and I have published this, Harold's landing in France is exactly opposite William's landing in England. That's not coincidence. One is meant to prefigure the other. It's a medieval way of telling stories. So somebody had to think it through. And I know when you go to bed at night and you're planning something, you have all these wild ideas, but actually to get that idea onto what? They didn't have paper, onto little wax tablets, onto parchment. Was there a written form of it? I don't think so, not of the whole thing, but perhaps some drawings, some sketches that this relates to this. And I published an article on crossings of water and how they're placed, how when it's urgent, the channel shrinks to this. When it's really significant, the channel goes on and on and on through a long scene. So minimum 3 years, perhaps as long as 8 or 10.
Thank you.
But don't quote me.
I don't see anything else in chat. Yvonne says, thank you for your insight from a different perspective and not just an historical event. Are there any other questions from the people on Zoom? All right then. Well, Gail, again, this was just spectacular. I tell people, you don't have to go to college, just join the Constellation chapter. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed talking to you, and I will look for your picture of the box and try and send it to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you
Bye.
very much. Great,
Bye-bye.
great.